In this lesson, we are predicting gas exchange. So this is an extension of our information about the respiratory system, and we're specifically using data this time. All right, it's important to first understand what partial pressures are for this. Now, the partial pressure of a gas is how much pressure a gas contributes to the total pressure of a gas mixture. So the partial pressure will influence the diffusion rate if we're talking about our respiratory system. So in the case of gas exchange in the lungs, we're talking about how quickly oxygen can diffuse into the bloodstream and how quickly CO2 can diffuse into the lungs to be breathed out, right? So recall that oxygen needs to go from the alveoli into the capillaries to travel within the blood system to the tissues, and then it needs to diffuse from the bloodstream into the cells, and CO2 does the reverse journey. It's really important to remember that this is actually a passive process, so it's all happening with a concentration gradient. In this situation, it's a partial pressure gradient as well. So we talk about pressure using the units of millimeters of mercury, or mmHg, which you will see around the place. And this is a unit of pressure that is equal to the pressure exerted by a column of mercury 1 millimeter high at 0 degrees Celsius under standard amounts of gravity, right? It's a bit fancy, but just go with it. When there are two gases mixed together, the pressure that each of them exerts will add to give the total pressure of the system. Now, at sea level, the pressure of the atmosphere is 760 milligrams of mercury. And since we know that the atmosphere is a mixture of gases, and we know the percentages of total gases, we can actually calculate the partial pressures that each gas exerts. So for nitrogen, for example, it would be 78.08% of 760, which is 593. Now, when we apply the same information to the gases in our alveoli, in our bloodstream, and our tissues, it can explain the movement of gases between these areas. So within the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 104, about 100, right? Depending on what you read. So the deoxygenated blood that is running around in the lungs, it's coming in with a really low partial pressure of oxygen, about 40. And this means the oxygen wants to diffuse to an area with lower partial pressure. So our oxygen is going to diffuse into that deoxygenated bloodstream. When it gets to the tissues, so obviously it will increase that partial pressure of oxygen. And when it gets to the tissues, again, it sees, well, it's got quite a low oxygen partial pressure there, so I'm going to jump into the tissues. And that's all happening in a passive way. Now, carbon dioxide goes through a similar yet reverse journey. It's always influenced by partial pressure. So if we start in the tissues down here, once cellular respiration has occurred, there's a bit of CO2 sitting around. The partial pressure is about 46, but it can see that the oxygenated blood coming around's got a carbon dioxide partial pressure of only 40. So we'll hitch a ride in here and move to that area where there's lower partial pressure. This will get pumped back around to the alveoli. It'll see that the alveoli has only got a partial pressure of CO2 as 40, and it will jump into the alveoli and then be exhaled. So this mechanism is brilliant if you continue to inhale oxygen. If you begin breathing in huge amounts of CO2, it can impact these partial pressures and normal gas exchange can't occur. And we can calculate partial pressures based on the total pressures, as we did before with the atmosphere, with percentages and the total amount in the system, so that we can predict the direction of travel. So we'll look at this in class as well, but remember they're always going to travel to an area exerting a lower partial pressure, just like that diffusion we've spoken about earlier with concentration gradients. So some calculations have to be done first, but it isn't solely just about the percentage, it's also the total pressure of the system. All right, now gas is transported in red blood cells using a protein molecule called hemoglobin. It is made up of 4 polypeptide chains and combined oxygen and carbon dioxide. And we can see in these different depictions, but there's always going to be 4 subunits. There's 4 polypeptides in that large molecule. The heme group within the molecule will contain an ion of iron, right? And you can see that little Fe here. This is why when you're anemic, saying you're low on iron, you feel run down, because your blood might not actually be able to efficiently make these heme groups that are needed for hemoglobin to bind, and therefore it's not going to transport oxygen quite as well. Now, there are different kinds of hemoglobin, and it's slightly different between an adult and, say, a developing fetus. There's also something called myoglobin, which is related to hemoglobin. It does a really similar job, but it exists within skeletal muscles. So the hemoglobin and myoglobin molecules have an affinity for oxygen, right? How much they like it, and their ability basically to hang on to that oxygen. Fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen than adult hemoglobin, and myoglobin has an even higher affinity. This is an oxygen-haemoglobin dissociation curve, and it shows the relationship between oxygen levels, right down here, and hemoglobin saturation. So there is a low saturation of hemoglobin when oxygen levels are low. Makes sense, right? Oxygen releases the O2 in hypoxic tissue, so low oxygen tissues, it's going to release that. But there's a high saturation of hemoglobin when oxygen levels are high. So hemoglobin binds oxygen in oxygen-rich tissues. Fetal hemoglobin is shaped slightly differently on this curve to adult hemoglobin. It has a higher affinity for oxygen, and it's going to bind oxygen when adult hemoglobin is releasing it. And this is really important at the placenta, right? A mother's blood will move around, drop off the oxygen, and the hemoglobin in the fetus should be able to pick it up. Now, after a baby's born, the fetal hemoglobin is kind of replaced after 6 months, and they get that adult hemoglobin again. Myoglobin is found in skeletal muscles, and it's got an even higher affinity for oxygen than, say, even fetal hemoglobin. It becomes saturated at a really low O2 level because it's only got one heme group, so it doesn't have to bind 4 things to be saturated, it only has to bind 1. But because it's got a really high affinity for oxygen, it doesn't like to release it, so it holds onto it until the oxygen supplies in muscles are really low. Now, when you compare these all on the same graph alongside, say, I think there's one other in there, maybe it's got health problems or something, you can see that there are left shifts and right shifts depending on the situation. Now, hemoglobin can also bind carbon monoxide, which is a pollutant from burning, combustion. So maybe it's produced in cars, things like that, which run on carbon-based fuels. The issue is that hemoglobin has a really high affinity for it. So once you breathe it in and it gets into your bloodstream, it's really hard to detach from your hemoglobin. Now, there are also many forms of anemia, but one of the really common one is iron deficiency. And we talked about the idea that if you don't have the iron in your heme groups, then you're not going to be able to bind oxygen really well. Now, ours is obviously not the only kind of respiratory system, and fish and insects and birds and reptiles all have incredibly complex structures in their bodies to function. Our focus this term is only on human ones. So let's have a look. We're using data presented to predict the direction of movement, and we're using oxygen dissociation curves as well.